Losing weight is a delicate balance of caloric restriction, but also making sure that your calories don't get too low. If your calories get too low, well, your metabolic rate comes to a screeching halt and weight loss becomes more difficult. But when you're just tracking calories or you're looking at things at a very basic level, it's very difficult to determine when you are too low. Your body has different demands all the time. So to be able to say, hey, I'm not eating enough based on an arbitrary number that's written in a log is really kind of foolish. So what are some things that you can pay attention to know that you are not eating enough? Let's go ahead and dive right in. The first one is one that happens after a longer period of time. Now, that is feeling cold. If you restrict your calories right now, I don't think you'll start feeling cold tomorrow or the next day or even next week. But over a period of time, weeks, months, years, you might certainly start feeling a reduction in your body temperature. There was a study that was published in the journal Aging that looked at this specifically. It took a look at 24-hour body temperature, and it found that people that were in a caloric restriction phase ended up having significantly lower body temperature than those that were not restricting calories. In fact, they even compared this to an exercise group that was putting themselves in somewhat of a caloric deficit via exercise compared to just via diet. And then of course they compared it to a control group that was the Western diet. But that doesn't tell us a ton. It tells us something we kind of already know. Resting metabolic rate decreases, and yeah, you're gonna get colder. But why is this happening? So for this, we look at a study published in the Journal of Endocrinology and Metabolism. Very similar in design. Took a look at caloric restriction, exercise, and Western diet. And they took a look at people that were restricting calories between 3 and 15 years. So quite a long time. What they found is that the longer people were in a caloric restriction phase, the lower their levels of T3 hormone were. That is their thyroid hormone. Now, we see in other data that when T3 is elevated, body temperature increases. When T3 is suppressed, body temperature decreases. Now, I don't want to scare you and make you think that if you restrict calories, you're going to plummet your T3 levels. First of all, your T3 levels will come back. The thyroid is very resilient. But second of all, that's just the mechanism. It's not the end of the world, but it is a very clear sign. If you start noticing you're cold all the time, take a week, increase your calories, take 2 weeks, increase your calories, see if it restores, and then go back to restricting calories after that. The next one is you might start feeling weaker. Now, I'm not talking about just general fatigue. That can definitely happen with caloric restriction, but I'm talking more about actually feeling like you have less strength. So with this, we look at a study that was published in the journal Obesity. Took a look at physical activity alongside weight loss. And ultimately, they found out that when people were losing weight, on average, they ended up having about a 12% reduction in strength, 12.4%. Now, what's interesting is that this could possibly be mitigated by increasing protein intake. So what we started to see in the research now is that your strength and even your muscle mass can ultimately be retained even if you're in a caloric deficit, as long as your protein needs are met. Unfortunately, when most people lose weight, one of the first things they cut out is protein. And I have some other data to share with that. So the bottom line is that if you start feeling like your strength is going down, first of all, that is an indicator that your calories are probably too low. You should still be able to maintain strength. But the first course correction that you would want to do there is replace some of your carbohydrates or replace some of your fats with more protein. Because if you want to stay at the same caloric deficit that you're currently in, you need to compensate with some protein so you still have the stamina to lift and to work out and to do even aerobic training to maintain muscle. The next one is going to be sleep. Now, if you start noticing that your sleep is going to garbage, this is a very good indicator that you're eating too little. And this can happen very fast. This can be something that can happen as quickly as 2 or 3 days into extreme caloric restriction. But what's interesting, if we take a more detailed look at macronutrient ratios, and we look at a study published in the journal Epidemiology that took a look at over 4,400 people, well, we find that it's less about the calories and once again, more about the protein. So this study demonstrated that people that ended up eating less than 16% of their calories from protein ended up having worse issues with sleep. They had a harder time falling asleep and their overall sleep quality was poor. So yes, when you're in a caloric deficit, you have increases in adrenaline, in cortisol, in epinephrine, and that will definitely impact your sleep, but that's a little bit more extreme. Like we see that in people that are fasting or doing longer, more extended bouts of caloric restriction. The protein restriction is really the most common thing. And remember that the more you're training, exercising, even cardio, you're increasing your protein demand. So you are making this problem even worse, because if you're not eating enough protein at baseline and then you're adding exercise on top of it, you're definitely not getting enough protein. So simply increasing the protein despite calories being low, you can improve your sleep. If you're curious to check out something that I do to get more protein in, I popped a link down below for ButcherBox. It's a way to get grass-fed, grass-finished meat delivered right to your doorstep. So they've got really high-quality grass-fed, grass-finished beef. So great fillets, New York's, ribeyes, ground beef. They also have a bunch of really interesting things like ground bison. They have scallops, they have salmon, they have cod, they have chicken. They have just about everything you can imagine these days, and it gets delivered right to your doorstep. So that link down below is also going to have some special offers that ButcherBox puts out there. So sometimes it's ground beef for life, sometimes it's New York strip steaks, all kinds of different things that go on at different times. So that link down below can get you special access to ButcherBox, but also gives you an opportunity to take advantage of whatever specials they're running right now. So anyway, that link is down below if you want to check them out. ButcherBox, top line of the description, right underneath this video. Okay, let's talk about just simple fatigue and being tired for a minute. If you've been restricting calories for a long time and you start noticing that you're just not feeling energized anymore and you're having a hard time getting motivated, I think we need to go back to basic energy balance for just a second. Okay, your body is essentially going into power save mode. When you first restrict calories, you feel really good. Okay, you're reducing inflammation, you get more energy, you actually feel more alive and more energetic. And that lasts for a couple of months sometimes. But then unfortunately, what ends up happening after that is that you end up in a situation where your body has to go into preservation mode. Your calories are so low, it's like when your iPhone gets below 20% and it goes to the yellow battery bar and it kind of downregulates the performance to preserve battery life. That's kind of what happens with your body. It's like on the surface, you don't necessarily notice it, but when you start asking for more from your body, it just doesn't have it. You can't have lots of apps open on your phone when it's in low power mode, and you can't do high energy tasks when it's in low power mode. And if you do, it gets glitchy and kind of weird, right? That's sort of what happens with your body. So if you start noticing over the longer term, you're like, hey, why am I so fatigued? That's a pretty clear indicator. And what you do with that is take a strategic diet break. Okay, so take 2 or 3 weeks and increase your calories up to maintenance level. So that doesn't mean you go back to what you were eating before 6 months ago. It means you need to increase your calories so that you're at baseline with your current weight. You may not know what that looks like and you might have to do some guesswork, but the most important thing is don't go back to eating in a surplus and don't go back to eating how much you were eating at your heavier weight. Just slightly increase your calories and try to maintain your weight for 2 to 3 weeks and then go back into caloric restriction. And you'll find that that really recharges you quite well. Another thing that you might notice is you're in a little bit more of a bad mood. It's almost like you have a more cynical outlook on life. And we've all heard of being hangry before, but this isn't like short-term hanger. This is more long-term mood disorders that end up happening as a result of being in caloric restriction mode. And it comes right back down to that power saving mode. It's like the brain isn't able to operate at its maximum capacity. It's like you've downregulated regions of your brain as far as priority. The Journal of Health Psychology published a paper that found that people that had more dietary restraint ended up being more irritable, not just in the short term, but in the long term. Now the problem is this isn't very clinical, this is observational. So then we look at another study that was much more, well, clinical. This one was published in Brain and Cognition, and they had subjects just go through 2 days of extreme caloric restriction, and they found that this impacted their mood significantly. It made them more irritable, it increased tension, increased anger, and overall decreased their cognitive performance. So this can happen very quickly too. But over the long term is where you start to notice it. And that happens. You notice people that have been dieting for a long time, they just start complaining about things more. And again, it's just because the brain demands a lot. And you only have so much in the way of resources that your brain can pull from. And if you start going into that low power mode, what's it supposed to do? The next thing you might notice is anxiety. Now, this is a hard one because sometimes people have anxiety whether they are calorically restricting or not. But if you look at a study that's published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Child Psychiatry, They found that when they looked at teenagers, the more that they calorically restricted, the more anxiety they had. Now, you could kind of poke some holes in that because you could call reverse causation on that. Maybe people that are more anxious tend to calorically restrict more, right? If you're more anxious, maybe you're more likely to be bulimic or anorexic or have an eating disorder. So that's not clinical enough. Let's look at another study. This one was published in Mechanisms of Aging and Development in 2022. It was a rodent model study, but still very interesting. When they took middle-aged rats and they put them on a 60% caloric restricted diet, they found that it was kind of all over the place in terms of how it affected their anxiety and depression. But when they did the same thing to older rats, they found that it almost invariably made them more anxious. What we take away from this is our ability to withstand and our resilience to be able to deal with caloric restriction goes down as we age. So it's not exactly what we want to hear, but we should try to establish the most metabolic benefit with caloric restriction as early in life as we can. Now, that doesn't help the people that are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s that are overweight and trying to change, but it's important to note that if you're in your 20s or your 30s, do the hard work now because you can deal with it better. But what do you do if you're older? If you're older, you need to be paying attention to the protein significantly more. And if you're older and you're calorically restricting, you need to make sure you're taking those adequate diet breaks. Because even though you are trying to lose weight, your body is still needing that repair and that recovery signaling from adequate calories. As you're older, you might also be more sensitive to the effects of adrenaline and epinephrine that are coming as a result of caloric restriction. So one of the ways that you can get around this a little bit is by increasing your protein intake once again. Whether it's going to be a protein shake or more beef or Greek yogurt or whatever it is, increasing that protein is going to be a good way to kind of get around some of the anxiety symptoms as well, because you're increasing those tryptophan levels, which can increase serotonin, help you feel more calm. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.